Bring us all the latest in the ever-escalating conflict in the Middle East is former British commander Richard Kemp, live from Tel Aviv. Richard, thanks so much for coming on the program. I want to start here because Rita had just mentioned the media class here and how they misreport so much of what goes on in the Middle East and in between Israel and the Palestinians. There's just been a report come down about the BBC and the way they have mishandled their coverage of the Israel-Palestinian conflict since October 7th. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, I've read this report that's just been issued, and I've also been watching a fair bit of BBC coverage since the war began. Painful though it is to watch, because there is no question in my mind that every time the BBC covers the war out here in Israel, it is horrifically biased towards Hamas. There's always undue criticism of Israel, and they go easy on Hamas. There's no doubt in my mind that is a consistent editorial policy, and it's been that way with the BBC for a long time, not just during this conflict, but certainly since I can ever remember BBC covering the Middle East. There's just and it's not even necessarily only a factual bias, but it's also in the tone of their reporting and the way that they try and interview, for example, IDF spokespeople and things like that. Always, at least the implication that the Israeli spokespeople are lying, and that's the kind of impression you get. And this report has essentially, I think, borne that out and suggested that I think since the war began, at least 1,500 times the BBC has breached its own editorial guidelines for impartiality on the conflict over here.
Shocking. And of course, in the UK, you have to pay for a license to watch the BBC. I think that's a shocking dereliction of people's money. But anyway, Rita.
Switching to the US and the support they're providing to Israel right now, the Biden-Harris administration seems to be wavering. We had Biden even this week come out and say that Netanyahu isn't doing enough to secure a ceasefire. Explain what's happening in that relationship and what the impact is on what Israel does next.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the key issues here in Israel at the moment is the ceasefire oblique hostage release negotiations that have been going on for a considerable time now. And, you know, as you mentioned, just recently, President Biden suggested that Netanyahu is not doing enough to get the hostage released. Yet, in recent weeks and recent days, in fact, the deputy director of the CIA has praised Israel for going pretty much all the way as far as it can possibly go in terms of compromising on negotiations, and the same is true of Secretary of State. So there's mixed messages coming out of Washington, and the Prime Minister over here, Prime Minister Netanyahu, recently spoke to try and clarify the situation, which is that effectively they're the ones that have shown flexibility as much as is possible, and it's not possible to completely accept all of Hamas's terms, but Hamas have been completely intransigent. One of the key issues that is being discussed here is the Philadelphia corridor, which is essentially the border between Gaza and Egypt, which Israel is currently in control of. It's a lifeline for Hamas. And there's some people who suggest that the IDF should withdraw from that corridor in order to encourage Hamas to come to some kind of deal. Other people, like the Prime Minister and some of the people around him, say this can't happen. This is basically our, most critical ground in Gaza for completing the mission of destroying Hamas in Gaza.
James McPherson.
Richard, we're all aware that Iran, of course, is stirring up trouble in the region. But I want to ask you about Turkey, because overnight the president of Turkey has met with the leader of Egypt, and he has said there needs to be an alliance of Islamic nations against Israel to stop what he calls Israeli expansion. Can you believe it? Can you talk to me about Turkey's involvement in this? Is this just hot air, or is this a serious threat from Turkey?
I think there's a great deal of hot air has come out of Turkey since this conflict began. And even beforehand, Turkey was talking about Jerusalem belongs to us. It's Turkish territory. And of course, it was at one point the Ottoman Empire did control this entire territory, but that was in the distant past. So I think my view is that this is more than anything else is hot air. I don't think there's a real threat from Turkey against Israel. Obviously, there is diplomatically. But of course, Turkey is a member of NATO. And for Turkey to do anything aggressive against Israel would be met with, considerable, I think, displeasure from the United States. As for Egypt's been playing a double game. Egypt facilitated the arming of Hamas. It allowed Hamas to bring weapons, munitions, and equipment to turn Gaza into the fortification it is today. Sometimes maybe by playing a blind eye, sometimes by openly allowing stuff through, but nevertheless, it was really because of Egypt's position that Hamas developed as it did, supplied by Iran, but allowed through by Egypt. And the IDF have destroyed, I think, my figures may not be 100% correct, but I think they've identified and destroyed around 200 tunnels crossing the border between Gaza and Egypt. I was in one of them myself a few days back inside Gaza, a tunnel that you could easily drive at least two vehicles side by side through that.
Wow.
Tunnel. And that was just one of a huge number of tunnels that have been dug by Hamas to get munitions, and not just munitions, but other equipment through the border there. And Egypt's been allowing it. And at the same time, Egypt has closed its border to refugees. There are a lot of people from Gaza who could have escaped the war through the Egyptian border, as really is required under international treaty by Egypt, and Egypt's just simply refused to do so. It's one of the few times I'm aware of in history that a neighbouring country that it's at peace has completely closed off its border to refugees from a country that's at war where they're in danger.